This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
We welcome the Republican nominee, President Trump, and the Democratic nominee, Vice President Biden.
After entering the stage from different sides, a socially distanced Donald Trump and Joe Biden stood physically as far apart in the first presidential debate as they are on the politics. One divisive issue was face masks during the coronavirus pandemic. "I wear them," insisted the president. But here's the kicker.
I don't wear masks like him. Every time you see him, he's got a mask. He could be speaking 200 feet away from it. He shows up with the biggest mask I've ever seen.
Mr. Trump's supporters don't like face masks much either. At this rally in New Hampshire at the end of August, a tannoy request for the crowd to wear them by law was met with a chorus of boos.
Ladies and gentlemen, in accordance with New Hampshire Executive Order 63, please wear your masks.
Now, the President of the United States has COVID-19. So does the First Lady. Both possibly contracted it from White House advisor Hope Hicks, who travelled on Air Force One before being diagnosed herself. Our editorial column says during this pandemic, it's time for politicians to take responsibility.
The world woke today to the news that Donald Trump has tested positive for coronavirus. In this country too, a positive test is causing a storm of debate. The SNP MP Margaret Ferrier admitted she travelled to London while showing symptoms of COVID-19 and awaiting a test result, before recklessly catching a train home after receiving a positive result. The point, as the vast majority of the public will understand, after so many months of selflessly trying to follow the rules, is that while bringing the virus on oneself is foolish, acting in a way that will accelerate its spread to others is shameful and a betrayal of fellow citizens. Responsible conduct by our leaders in future is a must.
With me now is Julie Norman, a lecturer at UCL's Centre on US Politics. Julie, this diagnosis this close to the election, with a country so divided on the issues around the pandemic, is this going to change attitudes?
Well, David, I think that the fact that the U.S. has been so divided over corona in particular, the country is polarized on a lot of issues, but the fact that the pandemic also became so divisive was really notable in terms of how seriously people took it, whether they wore masks, whether they were social distancing. And of course, a lot of that was in somewhat ways inspired by Trump's own comments and his own behaviors and actions around the virus as well. He downplayed the severity of it. He, up through this week, was saying it's not a threat. He was very clear that he didn't feel wearing a mask was necessary. So I do think the fact that he has now been diagnosed and has this positive test will at least shift some of that thinking around the virus itself. I don't think it'll make the country less polarized on all those other issues, but it might at least quell some of this hyper-partisanship around the pandemic itself, which we've seen over the last 6 months.
Are you expecting to see more face masks at Republican events now?
Well, I will say on one thing I would just say is that many of Trump's own supporters and Republicans have disagreed with him with his response to the public health directives. And I think about 40% of Republicans have been polled as supporting wearing masks and doing so already. But with that said, we've obviously seen at his campaign events, most people not wearing masks. And I do think this will change that moving forward. And that will just be something that, again, leading up to the election, even after that, will be something that will carry forward for Americans.
Given his statements on wearing masks, given that he was appearing at lots of rallies with lots of people around him, was there a sense of almost inevitability that this was going to happen?
Well, I do think there was a concern from many public health officials and from many of Trump's own aides. And indeed, some of his own aides had contracted the virus previously to even Hope Hicks this week. Several Secret Service agents had contracted the virus. So it was known that people around Trump were being exposed and that the way that he was doing his rallies and events would make him exposed. So in that sense, I don't think it was necessarily a huge surprise that this was a possibility. But of course, coming as it did, when it did, was still quite jolting.
Now, Julie, I know you've not exactly got a live feed into the Oval Office right now, but in your expert opinion, what's happening in the White House just now?
Trump was at events up through Thursday night. And so right now, what we're hearing from the White House is that the president is continuing to go about his business as usual and, that things are moving forward right now. Again, how that looks next week, depending on the severity of the virus for him as an individual, might change that. But for right now, it's a lot of damage control, I would say, in the White House today, trying to deal with this issue, trying to think about how to work his campaign moving forward. Trump had a lot of events on the docket for the next couple of weeks. Those have all had to been cleared while he stays in quarantine in the White House, along with the First Lady.
Yeah, his officials and his doctor have all said that he is continuing to work with no disruption. To be fair, they said similar things about Boris Johnson when he was ill with COVID-19, and later on it turned out not to be exactly the case. Is it possible for him to be continuing to work right now?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think for a lot of listeners here in the UK, they'll remember that time with Boris Johnson when the messaging was that he was fine, but in reality, we learned later that he was actually suffering quite significantly from the virus. Again, the diagnosis is so new, and the fact that Trump was out and about and not showing symptoms up through last night, my sense is that these statements today were probably genuine. But with that said, moving forward, even if his condition worsens, it's pretty typical for public messaging to suggest a sense of stability, to try and project a sense of calm, unless things are really at a dire point.
Now, we were all very much looking forward to the next presidential debate, Julie. I'm sure you were too.
Because the first one was so great, yes.
Is that going to go ahead?
Well, the second debate is scheduled for October 15th. It's in some question right now what that will look like now. There is some word that it might just be canceled. Trump will need to quarantine for at least 10 days, but possibly more. And it's possible that it will go ahead, but the format would be different, that it would simply be virtual and no sense of public contact whatsoever. But that's still being sussed out today.
Of course, the big question is, will the election still go ahead on November 3rd? There has been a lot of speculation about that, but that would be an enormous decision to delay that, wouldn't it? I don't think that's actually ever happened, has it?
No, and it would be massive to actually change the election around this. And really, since the start of the pandemic, there has been discussion about if the election would be postponed. Indeed, there was pretty much a consensus in Washington to not do that, and instead to try and rely more on the mail-in ballots and the voting by mail that many states have adopted. Ironically, Trump himself, of course, has pushed back quite strongly at that process, has suggested that it will lead to more voter fraud, suggested that ballots are being sold or dumped or what have you, and really pushing those conspiracy theories. But in fact, again, his own illness now, I think, underscores for Americans the need to look for other ways to participate in this election than going to polls that might be crowded with people. So this might actually increase some of his own voters' sense of needing to vote by mail.
Search for the leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.